when you invest funding into a particular venture, you should seek not just financial returns, but as much impact as possible. And in fact, social value investors, they're saying that as long as the venture returns capital so can be put back to work, but maximizes impact, those forms of investment frameworks are also acceptable and often desirable for certain.
Elena, thank you for being on Unleashed, the Dark Art of How to Make Ideas Happen, the podcast. It's a long title, I know. So how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Hi, Hussein. It's so good to see you, and thank you for inviting me to chat with you today.
Absolutely, absolutely. So can you talk a little bit about what you're up to these days and what are you excited about?
Oh, that's my favorite question. As a former recovering historian, I'm sorry to start with the disclosure that my answers are typically long, and I like to give context.
Oh, go for it.
But the quick context: my work always sits at the intersection of social entrepreneurship and impact investing. So I have 2 feet in both worlds. I love entrepreneurship in general, but I also recognize how critical and instrumental and sort of like exciting it is to be in the impact investing space, because they can sort of like be that catalyst to make those ideas come to life. So over the last few years, I worked with an impact investment firm. I've been a mentor and educator at different social and entrepreneurship incubators in Vancouver. Right now, I sit on the board of the National Social Value Fund, which is Canada's first student-led impact investing organization with locations in 5 Canadian cities. And I also run my own consulting firm, Olencha Consulting, where I work with social entrepreneurs, helping them go from idea to growth.
Awesome. That's actually what really excited me about talking with you and why I reached out is what got you into why social impact and how is it different than the usual investing for you?
I think I was always meant to do this work, and I've always done it. It's just I didn't learn the language and the frameworks until maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. What got me excited about, or what still gets me very, very happy and excited about impact investing in particular, is because it helps us redefine capital. It helps us introduce sort of funding mechanisms, not just as this sort of like agnostic like fuel that helps an idea come to life, but oftentimes impact investors, particularly social value investors, which is a sort of like a much narrower form of impact investing, they bring a lot of their values, and we're helping sort of redefine what capital does in this world, rather than looking at capital pursuing sort of like risk-adjusted returns, whereas the more risk you have, the more return you may expect. Impact investors are introducing impact-adjusted returns. So we're sort of trying to introduce this idea that when you invest funding into a particular venture, you should seek not just financial returns, but as much impact as possible. And in fact, social value investors, they're saying that as long as the venture returns capital so can be put back to work, but maximizes impact, those forms of investment frameworks are also acceptable and often desirable for certain social enterprises who don't have the business model to be business unicorns, but they're sort of creating really profound environmental or social difference in their communities.
Interesting. Do you see a difference in ideas that are meant for social impact from their beginning? Is social impact something that is added later? Tell us about a little bit about the strategy, because you worked with these kind of entrepreneurs. What is it like developing an idea when social impact is part of the work, a part of the thinking of the entrepreneur?
Mm-hmm. This is a great question. There are all sorts of social enterprises and all sorts of stories of how they started. I suppose my favorite and perhaps the most effective form of entrepreneurship that I've been lucky to work with are entrepreneurs who embrace entrepreneurship as a form of self-expression. So it's like the ultimate self-expression. When and sort of like this really kind of a long way to say that the best ideas for the business actually come from you. If the entrepreneur is willing and open and brave to confront her sort of like darkest fears, as well as to lean into her wildest dreams, the ideas can flow. And these ideas that are actually an expression of her true nature are the ones that often have sort of like a profound impact, as well as sort of like a longevity in the entrepreneur's resilience and tenacity to make it happen. And you know, a lot of organizations out there, they create businesses and sort of like they add impact later. So that also happens. Or perhaps they encounter someone and they realize like, oh, like it's not just a business model, we'll also do some good. I don't judge them. You know, like I said, there's all sorts of organizations out there. But I do want to make a distinction between the corporate social responsibility and organizations that truly have impact as part of their business engine. So it's very different how you approach a business, how you approach a team. If you simply say, I'll donate like a percentage of my profits to charity. So that's definitely on the corporate social responsibility side. And it's still important and needed and wonderful and should be celebrated, but those aren't true impact ventures, social enterprises. In my world, a venture that sort of truly embraces impact, whether it's hiring newcomers to produce food products, or recycling chopsticks in order to create furniture, without that social environmental impact as part of the business model, as part of the product, the venture wouldn't exist. So it's kind of like that's the continuum of the impact ventures you can think of.
It sounds like, and feel free to kind of correct it for me. It sounds like in its essence, the problem that you're addressing, by solving it, you will have social impact. So it's not that it's a portion of revenue, as you're saying. It's like if you address that problem, you will have a social impact. Does that?
That's right. Social, and or environmental. Impact, for sure.
Okay. Is it necessary that so when you're an investor, let's say, that does social impact, since you've dealt with many of them or worked with them, do you have certain focus that aligns with your values? If the entrepreneur's idea is an expression of who they are and what they think and as a person, is the investment also an expression of the investor and what they believe and the values they seek as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Again, a disclaimer, there are all sorts of investors out there.
Of course, yeah.
Impact investing is still an emerging field. We still sort of, there are some folks who say we don't invest in, guns, childhood labor, and pornography, therefore we're impact investors because we don't invest in evil. So I want to say, okay, there's some people who sort of muddy the definition, but absolutely, impact investors, particularly individuals and angel investors who are not sort of like burdened by the limitations of the partnership or like their external funders, individual impact investors who have started and sort of like are pioneering this field are able to take more risk and are really pushing those definitions because they have that freedom to lean into their values, like pursue their interests. And oftentimes, because angel investors invest in such early stage ventures, they work closest with entrepreneurs. So that sort of like personal chemistry and the personal alignment and values is so important. Yeah.
I think that's really important. Yes. What I'm curious about is your journey to get here. When did you have entrepreneurial beginnings at all? Like, did you start, building something, lemonade stand, something like that? How did you? What are some of the early beginnings that kind of led you down that path? And for you at least.
Yeah. Well, my background is I'm Russian Korean. I'm fourth generation ethnic Korean, was born and raised in Russia.
Oh,
So
wow.
I'm a daughter of immigrants, granddaughter and great granddaughter of refugees, and I'm an immigrant myself. And so, so Koreans in Russia is a very visible ethnic minority. They use education as a strategy to survive and sort of like adapt in the Soviet world. So when I was growing up, my family really wanted me to be a professor. Like they really pushed me to be an academic as a safe, great position. So nice for a girl to have a job security for life. In the meantime, I was surrounded by really strong personalities, including entrepreneurs, like my whole life. My uncle, he was one of the first sort of large-scale producers in like post-Soviet space. He fed like a family of 20. But I was most inspired by my grandmother and my great-grandmother. So when they were political refugees, my grandmother had to run from Japan. So she fled Korea when Japan occupied the country. They moved into the Russian Far East, and she had to sort of become an entrepreneur, back in the early 20th century to feed her kids. And then my grandmother, when her husband was arrested by Stalin and threw in jail for several years, she had 5 kids she had to feed. So she sold her jewelry, like whatever, a couple golden rings, and bought an old sewing machine. And by sewing and making clothes for the neighborhood, she actually sort of fed the whole family. Like that's how we survived. How my family survived post World War II. So I was really inspired by these women in my family who sort of like embraced it. Not that they wanted to, they definitely didn't have the language to be an entrepreneur and like, oh, I'm doing it. They just did what they had to take care of their families. And so it really motivates me. It really inspires me today. Also, I have a lot of empathy and sympathy for immigrant and newcomer women who come to Canada and face all sorts of systemic barriers to become a part of the country, to be able to take care of their families. And so as much as possible, I look for ways to support immigrant women's sort of opportunities to start businesses or grow businesses or be hired by businesses with living wage income. So that's sort of like where I come from and my own entrepreneurial journey. So I followed my family's pressure. I was pressured into going to graduate school. I studied a degree in cultural history at UBC, and I went all the way to PhD. I think like I was on the eve of my comprehensive exams. But in the meantime, I secretly was hustling and I was doing all sorts of like mini projects. I even invested in like a huge farm in Russia with my brother. We sort of like we bought a former Soviet collective farm, dairy farm, and we converted it into kind of like this architectural hub, and we did all sorts of things with it. And it was all completely secret from my parents. We just didn't want them to know that I was not 100% focused on becoming a professor. But unfortunately, my parents had passed away, and when my father had passed away, I had to really confront this reality that perhaps I was in graduate school not for myself, but for them, to make them happy. And so that's why I really sort of like advocate this. So confront yourself, like really look into yourself. And that's the process that I had to do. And when I realized that I was there for the wrong reasons, it became much easier for me to sort of leave, not finish graduate school, and instead really lean into all my entrepreneurial adventures. So I worked in tech, tried to do a couple of projects. My brother and I, we also still invest and we create some kind of cool tech products that we then license. And then I met this incredible impact investor while we were both mentoring at UBC Social Entrepreneurship Incubator. And that's when I learned that language and the frameworks. And I realized like, wow, a lot of those growth strategies, a lot of those hacks could actually be applied for something that I love, that I appreciate, that I want to see more of in the world. And sort of like that's where I started working more with impact investors. And I still cannot pick between the two worlds. and I don't want to. I want to both sort of work with impact investors to help them refine those frameworks, define sort of impact metrics, help them adapt the due diligence processes that fits into the social enterprise space. And I still want to work with social entrepreneurs because I want to see them succeed. And so that takes sort of like many forms and shapes.
That's fascinating. Such a fascinating story. Do you still have that farm in in the Soviet or in Russia right now? Is it in Russia right now, or one of the other?
It's in Russia. It's just outside of Moscow, and it's sort of, if you've ever seen Dr. Zhivago, it's like literally when you go there, it's just this just beautiful Mother Russia landscape, and the beautiful cows are still like we produce dairy milk, so the dairy is just a small part of it, but we also operate kind of like this commercial, almost like a conference space, wilderness retreat.
Fascinating. And so when you talked about social value investing as opposed to social impact as a segment of that.
Yeah.
How is that different from social impact, or where does it focus? If you can introduce that, please.
Sure. So if we imagine sort of like a continuum of funders, and on one end you have philanthropy that just gives money. So funding can be a grant. So on one end is foundations, government grants, and then on the other end you have purely for-profit sort of venture capitalist firms, right? So if we move from the venture capital towards philanthropy, we'll have corporate social responsibility, impact investors. Social value investors sit very close to philanthropic organizations, but they still sit on that for-profit side. So social value investors, they prioritize impact. So that's the kind of model that will be sort of like okay with simply sort of like the return of capital or modest financial returns. They're not looking at, like X multipliers, but what they're looking for is maximizing impact. So that's social value investing.
That's interesting. And how it developed is it in Canada, and is that something that is let's say a global kind of phenomena that's growing? Where is it in its evolution? Because it's my first time kind of hearing that. I know social impact, but social value investing is new to me.
It's very new. It's very new. I would argue, we've seen it practice again. We just didn't have the name, or we didn't have that concerted effort to develop it. I don't know who started it. Like I learned about this about 3-4 years ago when I was working with Helder Ventures, an impact investment firm in Vancouver. And this is a form of investment that's practiced by the National Social Value Fund. More and more angel investors are looking to be a part of it, but it's still sort of out there. It's still this crazy idea that why would somebody invest money and not sort of seek to multiply it? So the National Social Value Fund is having a lot of conversations with community foundations and different philanthropic organizations. So I imagine that in the next few years, philanthropic organizations are going to embrace it more than traditional sort of like investors. And the reason being is because that's a permanent refrain in the philanthropy world, that some problems, you're just gonna have to keep funding, like that never become self-sustainable. And so philanthropic organizations are now embracing this idea of perhaps some organizations actually do have a business model that would allow them to become self-sustainable, and therefore the charitable impact that we want to promote can eventually sort of like fund itself. And so philanthropic organizations are more likely to start experimenting with these ideas. As is perhaps Canadian federal government, but at a smaller scale, I guess. Everybody's still looking for examples, looking for ways to experiment on a small scale. But I think we're starting to demonstrate a few fantastic examples that we can sort of.
I love the idea. I love the idea a lot, and what it what I relate it to is sort of when somebody invests their time, they can give that time away to help somebody. Let's say compare it to philanthropy. If they don't have the money, they can do that. Many of us did that. They would go and you would give your time, and there is no return, and there is no, just you're just helping somebody. But then there is the time when you, for example, give your time for a cause that you believe in, and it's more kind of you help build it, and there is you're helping to build something that can then kind of continue beyond you. So I understand the driving, what can drive. Some people would give their time, energy, money, different aspects that we can invest. So I understand the drive. It's very fascinating. It's what are you, for you, in that aspect, where would you like it to go? If you're now, because you're now kind of sitting with the social value, what you called it, like the government, or is it the body of social value investing, and you're kind of probably helping to shape that. Where would you like it to go?
I sit on the board of the National Social Value Fund, and
that's
our philosophy is really our philosophy is to try to let students lead this. So where I would like this to go is I would like every community to have its own sort of coalition of a student-led or youth-led social value fund, with local philanthropists and angel investors that pool the capital to invest in social enterprise that solve social or environmental issues at a local level. So social value, for National Social Value Fund, our vision is national in scale, local in scope. We don't want sort of the capital to be concentrated in Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto. We want every community to pool its own resources to address local problems at a local scale. As far as sort of like the national, international scale of impact investing, I do want more impact investors and traditional investors, institutional and private investors, to embrace either social value investing or impact investing as a valid sort of like form of investing part of their portfolio. And I think we're seeing more and more millennials, as there's like millennials inheriting sort of like the parents' funds. They're demanding a different kind of investment options and opportunities from their managers. So I see both sort of like the demand pushing those availabilities, as well as I see a lot of social enterprises starting to sort of grow and offer more and more options to invest in. So overall, I just want I want our funding to shift from the pure capitalistic sort of pursuit of unlimited growth to funding starting to embrace sort of like a moral imperative to invest in solving environmental issues, social issues. I don't want the money to be divorced of ethical guidelines that we practice in everyday life, but somehow are not a part of the financial world as much as I think it has to be.
Yeah, that's such a contentious point, where how important it is that we live our life in a certain way that kind of makes it possible for communities and for people to work together. But so far, a lot of the business world is kind of separated from this, which sometimes is very frustrating. What are you seeing when you're working with entrepreneurs, because you're close to this, you mentor entrepreneurs, and you work as well with investors? When you're going to local communities, what are the things that you're seeing missing the most that will enable this to happen?
Mm-hmm. There is, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, sort of like an arc of an entrepreneur. Somebody may sit in the kitchen or lie in bed and they can have this idea. And so many of us sort of like dream and they have ideas. A lot of people who have fantastic ideas, they simply don't have the resources to sort of go from that idea to even like that early MVP stage. Folks who have a lot of privilege of connections to other entrepreneurs, privilege of maybe parents or their own savings to allow them to take some time off or even invest their own funding into developing the MVP, have a much easier time to start the business. What I see is a lot of people from sort of historically marginalized backgrounds who are very entrepreneurial, who are very driven, newcomers, differently abled folks, Black, Indigenous, people of color, who just don't have access to those resources. I think what is needed is a system for us to figure out a way to sort of like give like small grants, you know, $1,000 to $5,000 grants for folks to nurture that idea. So these small grants will subsidize some of the income they may lose if they were to spend the time working on this idea, or even that those sort of like first few expenses, you know, like buy a website, get an office space in a co-working space. Those are sort of in business budget worlds, those are really tiny expenses. But for someone who's working 2 minimum wage jobs and has a family to feed, those sums are astronomical. And so what I want us, you know, in order for us to create more ideas for that are created by people who have lived a living experience with these social and environmental problems, is to empower these people. In addition to, of course, like a network of mentors and sort of like all sorts of other support, you know, some kind of frameworks to train them, but resources to get sort of advice help are out there. I mean, more is needed, but what's missing is that sort of that initial grant system that would allow someone to really take some time off to work on an idea.
Fascinating. It's the reason I say that is because we are at part of my work that I'm focused on right now is to go to local communities and help them develop entrepreneurship, coming from the belief that entrepreneurship is a sustainable resource, in the sense that once you create entrepreneurship, it keeps on giving and giving and giving. So if you create that, you enable those local communities to kind of change their conditions, economic conditions, social conditions, because you create that. So this is fascinating to hear of when you say you're a national organization, but you focus on local. So that's actually pretty exciting for someone like me. It's like I'm getting really excited about that. When you work with entrepreneurs, so one of the things you said is that crucial period where they need that support, especially if their conditions don't allow them to do that. Like if you work in a job where it allows you, let's say, some financial residual, let's say, financial security, you can have that space to do that, even the mind space, because to develop something is not just the time, it's also the mind space to do that. If you're worried about your security, you can. What are some of the other challenges along the way that you've noticed entrepreneurs face, and in particular social impact entrepreneurs? Is there certain obstacles that are unique to them that you help them work through?
I would say for BIPOC individuals who are aspiring social entrepreneurs, one of the things that doesn't work for them, in fact, works against them, is the belief in our culture that entrepreneurship is sort of is a result of your own personal desire and tenacity. And if you work hard enough, and if you want it hard enough, you will make it happen. The work hard, play hard culture, bro culture of Silicon Valley is incredibly toxic. And it fails to recognize the incredible systemic privileges that sort of the bros have to allow them to focus single-mindedly towards the goal. For social entrepreneurs who are coming from different backgrounds, from modest backgrounds, oftentimes when I coach them, it's almost like I have to give them permission to go at their own pace and to define success on their own terms. When we turn on movies, when we sort of watch Silicon Valley, we see that the kind of entrepreneurship and the kinds of startups that are celebrated are the ones that can have this unicorn potential that change the world. And it's very easy for someone who's been judged their whole lives to say, oh, well, my idea is not good enough, and I'm not good enough because I don't see myself represented in this way. So this is sort of like one of the common problems that we work through. It's not just the business model, but it is really the mindset and the redefinition, like redefining what success is for you. Oftentimes someone, again, a parent who works multiple jobs will have very different time capacity and sort of like mental capacity to focus on an idea. This person could be just as motivated to finally become self-sustainable, to finally have the business that allows them to take care of their families. Like there's no question in my mind that a parent is probably more motivated to make this business a success than a non-parent. Yet we have to give them permission to do it at their own pace, and we have to provide them the resources to do that. So that's the biggest problem, the bro culture.
I think one of the things I'm almost tempted to kind of say, let's end here and talk more about that and how can we fix that, because I'm so this is something that I talk a lot about. The way I name it is I name it the hustle culture, that kind of myth that says, like you said, it is if you're passionate enough, if you're persistent enough, you're going to make it work. And somehow there's the implicit premise inside that says, well, if you're not achieving something, you're not passionate enough, you're not, doing enough. And then kind of there is the blame that people, and then they start comparing themselves, or why am I not this person? And why my startup cannot go through this perfect scenario of, idea, then investment, then something, and why are things taking time? So it put even more pressure. And there's very little talk about how founders go through this founder depression and the pressure upon them. And especially with what you're saying, if you're a father, you have your family to worry about. If you don't have those if you have humble beginnings or even humble resources right now, you have even more pressure. So you have all this pressure, then the hustle culture, then so it gets to people. So sometimes they just break. They say, I'm not going to do that. So I completely relate to that. What do you, so I love the idea of giving permission to them and having that conversation. Is there something that needs to be done, let's say on a national level, in our education, in our approach? I would imagine the question is yes, but what would be, if you had the magic wand to kind of do that, what are some of the key things that you would change right away to impact that kind of culture and kind of let it dissipate and go away?
It's interesting. First thing that came to mind is if we could teach the girls from young age not to apologize for things they're saying, not to apologize for having opinions. I see this, it's from girls in a young age all the way to university and sort of like young adults and professionals, still grown up. I catch myself saying this, if I'm in a room full of people and somebody asks for my opinion, or I muster up the courage to say my opinions, sometimes one of the first things I say is like, oh, sorry, here's what I think. So if there's a way for us to teach girls not to apologize for having opinions, for having original thoughts, that will probably take care of quite a few things. Let's see what else. I think we should teach financial literacy and sort of like entrepreneurship in school alongside mathematics and theater and arts. And I really love the culture of volunteerism in schools that North Americans. I went to high school in the United States, and part of my high school was in Russia. I really love the culture of volunteerism here. So I suppose if we could do more of it.
These are very good
those are the things
ideas.
that come to mind.
These are very good ideas. I want to dive on the first point a little bit. I get what you're saying, and it just hits me differently because I noticed myself doing that, and I always related it to, because I'm from Middle Eastern culture. I grew up all my life in the Middle East, so it's this thing about saving face and not wanting to kind of harm somebody's feelings or something like that. So I find myself doing close to that, and I worked a lot on myself not to do this. Like when somebody asks me an opinion, I'll just say it. But before I used to like, please don't take this the wrong way. Like I have my own version instead of like, please don't take this the wrong way. And sorry to sound, so blunt. We have our own way. And I noticed that even in Canada, it's a little bit more than, let's say, if you ask an American. So I wonder if you also can relate it to, or does cultural beginnings or ethnicity or belongings exacerbate that, or help you overcome it? Do you see that also kind of impactful or compounding on the fact that, say, if somebody being a girl or a woman?
I think it's a plague that's generic to almost all women in North America. And if a woman happens to come from a culture that has collective values, that I come from sort of Russian culture as well as Korean culture, and it definitely has a very strong collective emphasis on it. So that sort of like layers it even more.
Oh wow!
But how you grow up, people are complex individuals. All sorts of things influence who you are and how you are. Yeah. But it's really interesting for me to hear you say it, that also as a man, you sometimes experience it.
Yeah, I had to work a lot about it. I mean, I remember a conversation with one of the CEOs I worked with, and he came up to me and told me and said, listen, you're doing great work. I don't know if in your culture you don't ask, like you just don't ask, because I think you deserve a raise. And I find it very hard to ask for example, my relationship with money is always an issue. Like I find it hard to ask for more money. Whereas what his kind of when he said that, it kind of showed me that other people are always asking for money and more money, and now here I am doing the work but not asking for money. So that triggered him and say, are you leaving? Or, why don't you ask? So these are the things I started noticing. I said, yeah, maybe it is in my culture, because where I grew up, like money always associated with people who have money, they always change, they become bad. And like, so we build those things within us that are at an age where we don't have control. Right. And I think it's the same thing, let's say, maybe for, I know when we were raising my daughter, one of the things that hit me is when I started going to shop for her for toys. I had a conversation like that with another entrepreneur, is that when I went to shop for toys, all of the toys are dolls, and I wanted to buy her a Lego, and all of them are pink. There is a certain way that we put our people in a certain frame of mind, and it's not, sometimes it's not intentional, it's just systemic, and we just accept it. So my daughter's now like great in math, and it is like, that's what she chooses. It's not because she's a girl or or my son is a boy. It's just what you choose, and I think that's something that is interesting. I'm curious, when you see social impact entrepreneurs, is there a distinction between, let's say, if they're, let's say, women or men? Do we see, I'm just curious because I don't know, is there more women that are socially conscious or impact, or do you see it like across the board, doesn't matter?
I haven't seen any sort of like academic studies, so my answer is based purely on my observation. I see slightly more women taking up social entrepreneurship than men. But it also could be because I make the effort to work mostly with women.
Okay. It's interesting. The reason I would think so is because when we say the challenges, there are a little bit more challenges, not a little bit more, sometimes a lot more challenges that women face in life because of the
Mhm.
social structure. So they may be more
Mhm.
mindful. This is totally as well without looking at kind of
Mm.
any studies, but just the first thought that comes to me. It's interesting.
Mm.
Um, is there a difference in how I know, for example, that there's that focus on let's say women investors, women, let's say entrepreneurs, about raising them and giving them, let's say, because of the systemic kind of conditions that societies how they work, kind of giving them that platform or helping them. Do you see that there is a certain thing that needs to be done to help women, for example, um, focus on social entrepreneurship or helping them with entrepreneurship? What do you see from your point of view that needs to be done to help them
Mm.
be more participatory? That's basically what I'm getting at.
Is your question how can we have more women take up social entrepreneurship? Is that the
Yeah,
question?
I
Or
mean, I would argue, I don't know, obviously, because I haven't had that. I've seen both. I've seen men and women, I would say, are equally motivated to build things and get ideas, but
Mhm.
probably women would face different problems than
Mm.
men, or different kind of systemic obstacles or different barriers. So my question is there something that can be done from your point of view that is more to help women in a different way than helping men become entrepreneurs?
Yeah. Yeah. If I think one of the most critical factors for women entrepreneurs is having sort of supportive network around them. And if the woman's family or close friends stopped telling her, okay, why don't you give it 6 months? Because male entrepreneurs, when they decide to take entrepreneurship, they almost never get a deadline, a limited time scope within which they have to succeed. Whereas women, for some reason, hear from their families that, okay, we want to support your dream. Why don't you give it 6 months? But as you know, Fane, it's very difficult to start, launch, and sort of build a successful business in 6 months. And unfortunately, a lot of times, so people closest to the woman, not even her mentors or advisors who sort of may tell her the opposite, like it might take longer. Unfortunately, the people closest to her family who want the best for her, understandably, so they think that, well, you tried, so you always have this wonderful, fulfilling opportunity to go back to being a mother or a sister or a daughter or a friend.
Oh
So
wow.
that's one of the things that I think are critical.
You just kind of pointed something that uh, kind of hit me in a different way, where I think one of the things that I do is sometimes probably unconsciously is take it easy and ask women entrepreneurs to take it easier than, let's say, men entrepreneurs. uh, I think that's just comes naturally, just asking like, oh, take it easy on yourself, as opposed to a man entrepreneur is like, hey, you know what, no, push harder, stuff like that. I think that's very interesting how our approach to doing things. It just made me
Mhm.
realize that I didn't even give it another thought.
That's good. I said, I hope it makes you even better mentors for female entrepreneurs. But it's important for us as mentors and advisors to recognize that so like our advice comes in the context of all this other world that she's a part
Yeah,
of.
yeah,
And there are all sorts of opinions and sort of like influences that she's fielding and making decisions.
yeah. It's
Um,
our own biases. I mean, fundamentally, I do believe that you need to have people who, one of the reasons I'm doing this is to for people to hear um, the thought process and how people work with ideas from people who they can relate to for whatever reason. Somebody might relate to you because you had that experience of immigration, because of who your parents are, maybe sometimes because what your ethnicity is. People relate to people. We're very sophisticated human beings basically, and we relate to people in many different ways. Sometimes a story, sometimes your upbringing, sometimes something you said. And I noticed that, and I noticed that's why we need that diversity. You can't have I mean, I have a very high opinion of myself of being a great mentor, but I think it's very important to have a collection of people that give you different advice and give this sometimes the same advice in different ways. Do you see the, let's say, the ecosystem that we operate in the community has enough diversity of opinions, thoughts, you know, people that can help an entrepreneur? I mean, you're laughing already. Probably the answer is no. What do you, and what can we do to change that if there isn't much diversity?
Yeah. It's not enough diversity. So it's important to recognize that people who have the privilege, financial privilege, time privilege, are more likely to mentor. So, and oftentimes sort of the demographic profile of a typical mentor is an older white male who's financially successful and sort of for whatever reason decides to give back, although some of them unfortunately do it to boost their own egos. And when mentoring women, it's hugely critical for them to also have mentors who represent them. Unfortunately, women, again, this goes back to sort of the systemic barriers that women face. Women have a disproportionate amount of responsibility to take care of their families, to do work. They already take up so much additional extra stuff that they do, that they're less likely to mentor. Plus, a lot of times female mentors suffer from an imposter syndrome, and they themselves don't see themselves as sort of like experts that are able to offer valuable advice. So one of the things I'm advocating, and we've tried to do in a number of organizations, is actually pay female mentors for their mentorship. So that way, not just sort of like female, but particularly diverse female mentors that come from different backgrounds. So this way, we, number one, with funding, we recognize that they're experts. It helps them see themselves as experts. Number two, we know that if they're paid, they're more likely to commit and to sort of offer the advice and support over a longer period of time because they're compensated for their work.
Yeah, I think representation, I agree with you. I think representation is a very important thing, because what I've seen is entrepreneurs who relate to me in whatever way, they open up in a different way, and they share differently, and they listen in a different way. So I think I think that's important. I think that's something really important. What is it? What do you want to leave us with? This has been a great talk, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. What is one thing you want to leave us with? Maybe something that you're super excited about, or a wish from the people listening to participate, take part, help support you on your journey, and move with your ideas forward.
Oh, I have so many wishes for our community. I suppose there are two things that I want to leave our audience with. One, I hope that whoever listens to it maybe takes a minute to pause and reflect on their own privileges that they have today. Even as an immigrant, as a woman of color, every day I'm hyper aware of the privilege of my education, the privilege of my light skin, the privilege of my connections, and whatever privileges you may have, I want you to reflect on it. And I want you to understand that these privileges shape in a huge way the biases that you have, and they influence how you interact with others around you. And especially if you are in the sort of like the entrepreneurial ecosystem or social impact, social innovation space, it is absolutely of vital importance for you to be aware of how your biases are influencing the advice you give, the strategies you suggest. For social entrepreneurs out there, I have a call to action, and I'm going to say, don't be afraid to confront your fears. Don't be afraid to know who you are. Entrepreneurship is the best form of self-expression, but it's the ultimate form of personal development. Your ventures are only going to be as successful as deeply you're willing to dig within yourself and sort through some of the mud that's under there. and your ability and willingness and courage to let go some of it.
That is awesome.
These are my two thoughts.
That's great advice, and thank you very much for being part of the Unleashed podcast. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for the great insights and the great talk, and looking forward to connecting with you at a different stage as well to learn more about the great stuff that you're doing. Thank you very much for being here.
Absolutely, same. Thank you for having me. I look forward to hearing other folks you have on the podcast and reading your book.